Welcome. My name is Lisa Murray and I am the City Historian at the City of Sydney Council. I'm glad you've joined us today to explore Sydney's history. Today's talk is Remembering and Forgetting the Great Strike of 1917, and our presenter is Laila Ellmoos. Laila is a colleague of mine. She is a historian at the City of Sydney Council. Laila is passionate about communicating history to a wide range of audiences through exhibitions, talks, and the written word. She currently has an exhibition down at Customs House on some of the demolition books in our archives. And when Sydney gets out of this lockdown, we encourage you to go and take a look at that. Laila is a long-standing member of the Professional Historians Association of New South Wales and ACT, and she currently sits on the General Council of the History Council of New South Wales. Today, Laila is going to lead you on exploration of oral history testimony of Sydneysiders who experienced the Great Strike of 1917. Over to you, Laila.
Thanks so much, Lisa. And I hope everyone's having a good history week so far. So I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which I'm talking to you all today. I'm coming to you today from Wongal country, and this is where I am living, working and creating. I also, in other times I work on Gadigal country. So I pay my sincere respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm going to be talking to you today about oral history testimony about the Great Strike of 1917. So I really want to share with you the way that Sydneysiders who lived through this, this really important moment in our history, in fact, it's regarded as one of Australia's largest industrial conflicts. So I want to share with you the way that they remembered it in later life. So I'm going to give you a short overview of the Great Strike to start with, and apologies for anyone who's been coming to the last two talks, who came along to my last two talks, because I'm really going to be covering the same ground here to, I guess, set up what I'm going to be talking about and what the people will be talking about in the excerpts. I'll then give you a short overview of the Bicentennial Oral History Project Collection. This is held at the State Library of New South Wales and also the National Library of Australia, and I thank the National Library of Australia for providing such a wonderful resource online in digitising and effectively transcribing those interviews and making them available. I'm going to be playing you excerpts of audio so you can hear the voices of people talking about the strike firsthand. And as Lisa has mentioned, I do recommend that you listen to the clips through headphones rather than through the computer sound. If you have those handy, I found that myself, a much better experience. As I mentioned just now, the Great Strike is regarded as one of Australia's largest industrial actions. It erupted on New South Wales railways and tramways in August 1917. And this was in response to a new way of monitoring worker productivity, which was imposed during World War I. These new working conditions were known as the time card or card system, and you can see some of the time cards on the slide here. The strike started on the 2nd of August 1917, and this was when around 1,300 workers at Brandwick tramway workshops downed tools. And there's a photograph which is in this slide that shows the workers at this moment as they were downing their tools. The strike spread to Everleigh Railway workshops the same day, and around 3,000 employees at that workshops stopped work. And overall, 5,790 rail and tram workers around New South Wales, including from the country depots, went on strike on that very day. The new time card system added a layer of management in the workshops. It was considered to be an affront to the skill and craftsmanship of the rail and tramway employees. But workers across a range of industries, not just the rail and tramways, joined the action in sympathy, and these were known as sympathy actions. The strike was also significant in that it spread to towns and to cities across New South Wales and, in fact, across Australia. Overall, it's estimated that around 77,000 workers across New South Wales went on strike. So one of the outwardly visible features of the 1917 strike was the social protest that accompanied it. This included daily street processions, and these were so large that they often took an hour to pass a certain point in the street. There were also mass gatherings in Sydney's Domain, and these attracted upwards of 100,000 enthusiastic participants each weekend. Not just the striking men, but women and children too. The strike lasted for just over 6 weeks, and it ended when the trade union officials gave in to the Railway Commissioner's demands. So the year 2017 marked 100 years since the Great Strike broke out in Sydney. And in the years leading up to this anniversary, my colleague Lisa and I talked about how we would mark this event, but it had such a profound impact on the city. It was significant to us that the strike had happened during the First World War. And although the anniversary of this conflict, that is the First World War, was a subject of much popular and popular and public commemoration from 2014, the strike itself was not well remembered, and it had effectively slipped from our collective memory. The commemorative exhibition at Carriageworks, which was curated and presented in that year, it was an opportunity for us to look at the legacy of the strike. The exhibition brought together historical objects from diverse collections around Australia, including the State Archives of New South Wales, Sydney Trades Hall, and the National Library of Australia. The presentation of oral history was really an important element of the exhibition. This was so that audiences could have an opportunity to listen to the voices of people who had directly experienced and lived through the strike. So to explain why this was indeed possible, 70 years after the strike ended, oral history testimony was collected from around New South Wales as part of the New South Wales Bicentennial Oral History Project. This collection features 200 interviews that were collected and conducted with New South Wales residents between 1987 and 1988. These were really life history interviews, and they included personal experiences of people from a range of social classes, occupations, and also places around the state. What's really remarkable about this set of interviews is that one quarter of those interviewed for this project offered recollections about the 1917 strike. The majority of those interviewed were either children or teenagers when the strike broke out. Only one of the people interviewed was a striker, but there are 3 interviews with strike breakers. The remainder of the 50 interviews are with people whose family members went on strike, others whose families didn't strike, and others still who were affected by the strike more broadly. So what were the memories, stories, and legacies that were passed on to future generations about the strike? Many strikers or families of strikers expressed resentment and bitterness about the treatment that had been doled out to them and other strikers during and after this industrial action. Most of the people recorded in the oral history interviews remembered the associated hardship, in particular the food shortages and the lack of transport around Sydney. On the other side of the political divide, the strike is, of course, remembered quite differently. Then there are others who were asked the question about the strike, but they didn't remember it at all. And we can speculate that this was most likely because they or their family were not politically engaged or affected in any way. So excerpts from 9 of the 50 interviews were selected for display within the exhibition. I had to edit the interviews down, and the clips that we used varied in duration from a minute to about 4 minutes. And I've got a photograph here that shows how we displayed or presented the oral history interviews within the exhibition. People who came along to the exhibition were invited to sit at this railway bench. As you can see, it's for Medlow Bath railway station, and to use the headphones and to sit on the bench and to listen to the oral history testimony. The excerpts were edited together, and they had a bed of sound and also a brief introduction. And there was also a wall caption that just gave a bit more context. A small snippet from one of the oral histories was used in a soundtrack that we commissioned to accompany an archival black and white film about the strike. Interestingly, the interview that we used for this soundscape was with a strikebreaker, and his name was Foreman Crawford. Interestingly, I say, because he was by far, hands down, the best informant about the strike. He spoke about it, I think, for about 13 minutes. We also created a podcast to complement and promote the exhibition. And this was a way to explore the history of the strike and its legacies through the medium of sound. And it included excerpts of 13 interviews. We not something that we did, but there's a film that was made that documented the exhibition made by some filmmakers in Sydney, and they also use these oral history excerpts. And there's a special screening of this film, which is called The Great Strike 1917 for History Week. It's happening tomorrow, and we'll put a link up in the chat about that at the end of the talk. And I think hopefully as the talk, while I'm talking as well. But I'm now going to share some of the stories and perspectives of the people who remembered the impact and legacy of the Great Strike of 1917, so we can better understand this moment in Sydney's history. So the first snippet I will play for you today is with Leslie Best. Leslie Best was born in Newtown in 1898. He was employed as a shop boy at Everleigh, working with the shop of Resta makers. Leslie was involved in the strike as a junior member of the ironworkers. He was a lily-white, so this meant that he stayed on strike until the end. But he was also in the strike defence band. The reason why I've shared the image in the slide with you is if you look very carefully, you can see people playing musical instruments. There's a trumpet and there's also a trombone. So Leslie Best didn't go to the regular street marches or the pickets. And in this clip, he talks about putting detonators under the trams driven by the scab drivers on Enmore Hill.
And what happened when the strike started?
Well, they all went out. They all down tools one morning and went out. Everybody was called out. I was a junior member of the ironworkers at the time. And if you were out for 6 weeks, longer than that, most of the seniors were put off. They were sacked. Some of them might have got back again, I don't know, but us being underage, under 21, they made I was what they call a lily white. I was out there at the required time, you know, for the strike. I never, as they call it, scabbed it, you know. And but I was in the band. They had a strike defence committee band, and I had a ribbon too, and that's gone astray. They had a ribbon printed, strike defence committee band, to put round our hats. And we took the men, we marched in the band out to the tramway works. They were all out on strike too at Randwick to collect their last pay. We got our last pay in Wilson Street, Redfern, when our Wilson Street runs from Redfern railway station to Newtown Bridge. It's a big long street, and the top end of it near Everleigh was where they had all the pay boxes along there, along on the street, and we all had to go there and collect our last pay in Wilson Street.
That was after a few weeks of the strike, wasn't it? That was towards the end of August.
That was it.
And do you remember going on the demonstrations or the processions every day from Eddy Avenue to the Domain?
No, I didn't do them. No, I done the ones through the week, like the different places. I didn't do any of them.
Where did you go? Where did you go on procession?
We went to Randwick.
Yeah, where else?
And we went around different places, you know, but I never went into the city. I didn't go into the city, the band we had. But,
what about the pickets? Did you join any of the pickets?
No, I never done any of that. Now, one of my mates, no, I just waited time then, and I just didn't go back to work. And I had a mate, his father worked in the tramway, and his father used to do those detonators they put on the rails, the trams, see. And in the suburb I lived in, and he lived in too, there's Enmore Hill runs up a hill to Enmore Terminus, and it's a pretty steep grade. And in those days they put what they call scab drivers on, see, to take the place of the men on strike. And he'd got these detonators, and I used to sit with him in Marrickville Park on different days, and he'd slip up the hill and he'd put one on the tracks. And when they got halfway up the hill, bang, and it'd go off, and the driver get out of the stop the tram and get out of it, and they were looking him and the fellow that's the guard looking under for see what's the matter, you know. They done that. They're things that I shouldn't tell, but that's what happens. See.
So the next clip I'm going to play you is with Edna Ryan. Edna Ryan was born in Pyrmont in 1904. In this clip, she talks about the political and social context of the strike and the broader labour movement. She alludes in this clip to the IWW, which is the Industrial Workers of the World, also known as the Wobblies, and the case of the Sydney 12. And this is when 12 members of the Industrial Workers of the World were arrested on charges of treason in 1916. She only alludes to it, but I just wanted to give you a heads up if you're wondering what that is. She says that it was considered that the labour movement had won the conscription battle in 1916. She also recalls that there was strong anti-British feeling during the war, but that there was no hostility towards the soldiers on the front. So it's quite a complex picture that she's painting here. She discusses the impact of the Russian Revolution and the class consciousness of the working class in the early 20th century. This is quite a long clip here. It's about 4 minutes or so, but I think it's really significant because it actually gives you that broader context. And I just wanted to also say thanks to Lyndall Ryan for supplying this photograph of Edna. This photo was taken in 1953 when she was the ALP candidate for Mosman in the state election. Now I'll just play the clip.
I'm trying to find out how I would have known about the strike. I always knew about strikes. I think having lived in Pyrmont, we became quite used to being in the world and in the labour movement, because my mother and father had both belonged to the Australian Socialist League in the 1890s when it was formed in Balmain. And they knew Hughes and Holman, they'd met them there. So, and there was a local member of Parliament whose name was either McNeil or O'Neill in the State House, whom they knew, and my sisters went to school with the daughter. So this was the background. I don't think my mother herself was ever an actual member, but we were in it in a spiritual sense, and knew all about it. And I think I was reading the newspapers because I read the Herald every day. My mother must have got the Herald every day. So my father certainly would have when he was around. And they would have talked about the strike. And the thing I heard about the strike first, and on top of that, I had known a member of the IWW, and I had known all about the frame-up and the court case and the trials, and later the Royal Commission, but it hadn't been on by then. But they were in jail by then. And because when we lived in Woolloomooloo, every Sunday afternoon we went to the Domain while the war was on, and after the war.
What about before the war? Did you go?
And it was during the war that the strike was on, you see, which was a surprising thing. But I think the fact that we considered we had won an anti-conscription campaign, and I dare say that was the feeling in the working class movement and the trade union movement. There was a very strong anti-British feeling in Australia right throughout the war. It was that feeling. that turned down conscription. And although there's an ambivalence about this, that whilst there was this anti-British feeling, there wasn't any hostility to the forces, to the soldiers, to the actual individual, because they were our brothers who were going off as soldiers, and including my own brother, and a lot of lads were pressured into going one way and another. So that there wasn't any, in fact there was always a feeling of great comradeship with the boys at the front. And we knew they were going to vote against conscription somehow. That's what we told ourselves. That's what my mother used to say. And then whatever she said was very important when you're when you're a child. And I was about, in 1917, apparently I was only 13 years old, but I do feel I was older than that. And you see, if it was 1917, we would have not only been reading about this, we would have been reading about the Russian Revolution. And I'm quite sure that the Russian Revolution had a big impact on the working class in Australia. We knew about that. We knew the soldiers were leaving the front and throwing down their arms. We wanted our boys to do this too, you know. This was a very conscious, there was an enormous consciousness raising of the working class that I miss today. I miss it today. I'm used to a class-conscious working class, a socialist-conscious working class.
So Sam Carson was born in 1905. So he was about 12 when the strike broke out. He recalls in particular the strike having an impact on the Bankstown train line, which he lived upon. He was at Canterbury School at the time, so Canterbury Boys High, I guess. Sam also recalls that the strike had a greater impact than the First World War because people lost their jobs and there was a lot of personal bitterness that resulted from it. For him, the strike emphasised the difference between the workers and the companies, and many of his political and social ideas were developed through the 1917 strike.
Can you remember the 1917 general strike?
Yes, I can remember the 1917 general strike because that was at the time, it interrupted the extension of the railway from Punchbowl to Bankstown, or Lakemba. I think the railway, that line, railway line only went to as far as Lakemba. And then we used to have to get a bus to take us another half an hour to get to Bankstown. And that strike, I do remember. I remember that very clearly because I was at Canterbury School in those days. I recall also that with the strike, it did affect, you know, I mean, that was something that was probably something that more affected us than the war that was going on the other side of the world. Because people would lose their jobs, people were out on strike, and then there was a lot of personal bitterness in the 1917 strike. There was the difference between the worker and the companies, you know, the oppression, you know. I mean, the workers were just completely thrown onto the unemployment scrap heap. In those days, there was no such, you know, in those days we got public holidays, no such thing as annual leave, and no such thing as getting workers' compensation. Or you lost your job, you lost a lot.
So you really were on the side of the strikers?
I think that personally, I think that a lot of my ideas and political ideas and a lot of my social ideas, I think, were developed through that 1917 strike, that train strike.
So Gwen Green was a young girl living in Randwick, and she recalls the hardship that was caused by the strike. She says the strike was awful. Everything stopped. Bread wasn't being made, and trains and trams stopped running. And interestingly, she sympathised with the people that were on strike, and she was influenced in this by her father, who she says was a very liberal thinker.
Do you remember the 1917 general strike?
Yes, I do. It was terrible. I was only about 10 or 11. I don't remember what year it was.
The 1917.
Oh, well then I must have been old enough to know about it. It was awful. Everything stopped. I can't describe how dreadful it was, because bread wasn't being made, trams and trains ceased. Living was impossible for those particularly who didn't have any reserves. People with enough money to have foreseen that it would happen had accumulated flour and sugar and so forth. But it was really a very bad time.
Who did you sympathise with in that?
Well, I'm afraid I sympathise with the people who are striking, because in my opinion they are not really very well treated. And this, I suppose, stems from the fact that my father was such a liberal thinker, and he'd imbued us with his own kind of thoughts, and we were sympathetic to those less fortunate.
So I mentioned Foreman Crawford in the start of my talk. The interview with Foreman was recorded over 2 days in July and August 1987, and a total of 7.5 hours of audio was captured on these 2 days. So that's a really long interview. Foreman Crawford was born in 1891, which makes him 26 years old when the strike took place. He was from Alstonville, hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly, in northern New South Wales. And he volunteered for 2 months in Sydney as a strike breaker, mainly loading and driving horse transport around Sydney, and also loading a ship called the Boona, which was taking supplies to the front. So he went home in the end because he had small children. But in this clip, he talks about his time in Sydney, specifically the processions of strikers and the gatherings in the Domain. And I just want to say thank you to the Alstonville Plateau Historical Society for the photo, and also thanks to Finlay Ball, who reached out to me yesterday with an essay about Foreman Crawford and the strikebreakers from northern New South Wales. I think it just really shows you how collections are connected over time and space, and people are working on these projects, and these things that people leave behind can be imbued with such meaning. So I'm going to play the clip with you now.
Well, I was going to tell you about the processions that the strikers used to have. They'd be marching up the roads, and when it came to a Sunday, it seemed everybody in Sydney nearly would be in the Domain on Sunday, and the strikers also, they'd march onto the Domain, and they would be calling out, "Will we go back to work?" Like the leaders would say, "Will we go back to work?" And they'd all yell out, "No." And they had a few other things that they used to sing out. Can the cockies do our work? Then their company would sing out, "No." Can we milk their cows? Yes. Who gave the, did I say, will we give the cockies corn? No. And all these, they'd be saying this. Yes, who stole the monkeys' playground? The cockies. And of course they could do everything, but as time went on, we found each week they got a little bit weaker, and we could see that they weren't so confident. And as we went to our work, we'd be taken by, it might be by a tram or by a motor lorry or something to our work each day, and we'd see the strikers' wives often as we went through some of the suburbs, and they'd begin scratching themselves, and they would sniff, and they'd smell the gum leaves. Of course, they were ridiculing us all the time, but anyway, eventually some had to go home, some wait till it was over, but we could see that the strikes were weakening all the time, and it was nearly over when I went home, but some of them stayed a bit longer.
So Bernie Johnson was a kid living in Surrey Hills in 1917. He remembers the regular street processions and the brass bands going past his house, and recalls how the processions diminished as the strike wore on. He describes the strike as being a bitter thing because it divided the working class. And also he didn't realise the gravity of it at the time.
What about the 1917 general strike? Do you remember much about that?
Yeah, so the 17 strike, I didn't know, I knew roughly that they'd introduced some new way of calculating. They had to fill in a timesheet or something like that. And I lived in only one street back from Surrey Hills, and when the strikers used to march past, going down Elizabeth Street, they had the Army and Tramway band, you know, beautiful band, and hundreds of blokes marching behind it. And then as time went by, the band would get smaller and smaller, the crowd would get smaller and smaller, until finally it was just a ragtag rabble going past, you know, in the finish. And that was a bitter thing, because it divided the working class completely. They even formed the two unions, you know, the diehards and the others. That was a very serious thing, because I didn't realise that at the time. I was only a kid, but I can remember it.
So Arthur Emblem was a strikebreaker as well. He was from Tamworth in regional New South Wales. In this clip, he talks about his experiences coming to Sydney from the country and the involvement of Walter Wern in coordinating the strikebreakers. Walter Wern was the member for Namoy in the Legislative Assembly. Emblem claims that public opinion was against the strikers. And another shout out here to a regional historical organisation. I just want to say thanks to the Tamworth Historical Society for supplying this image. It shows Arthur Emblem and his dad sort of posing in front of a vehicle with their tennis rackets. So as I understand it, Arthur Emblem was quite the tennis player.
I can tell you about a strike in 1917. That's the biggest strike that Australia's ever known. The railways, the tramways, and quite a lot of others went out on strike. They called for volunteers, and there were 8,000 arrived in Sydney in a week. I was one of them. I was camped out in the Domain and then at Taronga Park. Taronga Park was just being built then. And we loaded boats, carted wool, guarded the trams at the finish. But, we had a lot of very funny experiences.
Did you drive the trains?
Drive the trains? No, we weren't operating the trains. But I did drive a horse-drawn lorry to cart wool out of Pyrmont.
Who organised the volunteers?
It was done through a politician by the name of Wern. He was a member for New England, I think. But he was the main one organising it. It was a Labor government at that particular time, and they refused to load the ships taking supplies to our army, and that's why volunteers were called. We loaded the ships. We loaded the ships in 3 days, where it took the warfish 5 days. and we had a lot of brushes with the wharf labourers. They were loading us, one occasion I can remember, we were loading a ship at Pyrmont. I think there was about 250 volunteers, and as we knocked off at 5 o'clock, there were about 400 or 500 strikers lined up outside the fence waiting for us. We were willing to go out and have a go, but of course we weren't allowed to do that. But it got a bit serious, and they called the army out, and I think about 100 army fixed bayonets, and they moved, the strikers moved on. There's no...
What was the public opinion?
Oh, the public opinion generally was very much against the strikers, as they were what is happening now. They were the beginning of socialists and the communist movement, dictators.
How long were you in Sydney as a volunteer?
4 months.
So Hazel Worker was also a strike breaker. She was studying pharmacy at Sydney University during the strike. And she remembers that the male engineering students ran the trains while female students, like herself, worked in the railway cafe. She says she worked around 10 full days over the strike period. She recalls that students thought it was great fun working on the railways as it was something different. And I think this puts a different spin on student radicalism to what we might assume.
And there was a big general strike in Sydney in 1917. You'd have been at university then.
Yes.
Do you remember that at all?
My word, yes. The boys ran the trains, the engineering students ran the trains, and we worked in the restaurant, the railway restaurant. And I remember the fellow that was in charge of the thing, he was telling us about, now you sell this meat pie for that meat. One girl said, how do you know when they're hot enough? He said, put your fingers through the hole.
Well, that's one way of telling you.
I can always remember that, because there was always a hole in the top of a pie.
Poor old fingers and poor pie for poor people that had to eat them. How long did you do that?
Oh, I think it only went a matter of a couple of weeks, I think. It wasn't a big strike.
But did you serve in the restaurant or the cafe every day?
Every day at the time, yes.
For how long? How many hours?
I don't think it would have been more than about 10 days.
Yes, but in each day?
Oh, yes, each day you went along, yes.
For the whole day?
Or about 9 to 4.
And there was a group of you that did that?
What's that?
There was a group of you that did that?
Oh, yes.
And were you all students?
We're all students, yes.
And what was the students' attitude to the strikers then? Were they anti the railway employees who had gone on strike, or were they feel they had a genuine complaint?
I don't know what it was, but we as students thought it was great fun, doing something different.
So, did you go into it for the fun of it rather
For the fun of it, yes.
Rather than from any political attitude or feeling about it?
No, I went in for the fun of it. Something different to do.
What about the engineering students that drove the trains?
Oh, they loved it, the experience. Quite a lot when they graduated became engine drivers. They rather liked it.
So they went in for it for the fun of it too,
yes.
And experience.
This is the last clip I'm going to play for you today, and it's with John Monaghan. He was born in Darlington in 1906 and was around 10 years old at the time of the strike. His recollections in this clip focus on the impact of the strike in the 1920s. He was a railway worker himself, and he saw the demotion of staff firsthand. He also witnessed the lasting enmity between workmates, in particular the running staff on the steam trains, so the engine drivers and the firers. And these are it's sort of depicting these workers in the photograph I've got here. The reason why this was significant is these people worked together quite closely, and they were forced to work alongside each other for days and in fact years on end. So John Monaghan's uncle was a lily-white, meaning that he remained on strike.
Now you were telling me about the conditions that occurred to those that had been on strike, and that they had been demoted as a result. Tell me about that during the 20s.
Well, on the running staff, when you were on the steam locomotive, you worked on goods trains in particular, some long hours, see, 10, 11, 12 hours. And you're on an engine with the fellow, you went to barracks, you cooked your food and you sat opposite him at the table you eat, you slept in the same room, and if you was away from home 3 or 4 or 5 days like we used to be, you were with that man more with your own wife and family. And if you had been a driver reduced and you were firing for a fellow that was much junior to you and getting more money, how could you be other than resentful? And you can imagine the atmosphere when you'd be stuck together and sitting at each other's lap practically for 11 hours on the locomotive and eating together at the same table and sleeping in the same room. It was a very nasty situation until the heat eased off a bit. And to make matters worse, I can remember my old uncle, after he was sacked and he never got his job back, he used to wear a thing, and this particular guard was saying something about, he said, you scabby so-and-so. He said, you'll never get one of these lily-white. They call them lily-whites. Those are the fellows that remained on strike. But they were called lily-whites. And what the department did, those that had been at the war, when they came back from the war, they were asked what would their attitude have been had they been working. Would they have been a striker, or would they have remained loyal? Whatever they said, that's how they were classified. And if you had been away at the war and you said, I'd have been on strike, well, you straight away went back behind the fellow that took your job while you was away.
So they forced the returned soldiers to fill out a questionnaire?
I don't know whether they were forced or just asked orally, but that's the attitude taken by the department.
Okay, and how did the old timers relate to you as a new timer?
Oh, well, I used to get a little bit fed up at times because they used to hark. I said, listen, I wasn't on the job in 1917. I said, if you hate that bloke, okay. I said, now I got to work with him and I find him all right. I said, so just leave me to run my race. Because I'd worked with fellows that had been loyalists. They were on the job, they didn't take another man's job, they just stopped at work. And some of those were much better mates than some of the so-called strikers, because it takes all sorts to make a world. And met the fact that one fellow, foreign forwards, every name mentioned he was so-and-so, so-and-so. I said, listen, George, was you the only fellow on strike? I said, according to you, everybody else is a B-bar.
So that's the last of the clips that I'm playing today. And oral history testimony, I think, has the power to impart personal and evocative insights into the past. So what I've played you today, I think, are very local and time-specific recollections of the strike. And these are not the types of detail that are normally included within the written historical record. Oral history provides an intimate way to experience the memories of people who lived through the strike. They bring to the listener their voices, their emotions, and their connections to this event. The oral histories draw out some of the diverse perspectives about this landmark event, and they help us to better understand its complexity from various viewpoints, and also the strike's lasting impact on both personal lives and society at large. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much.